Hello everyone. In this session, we want to talk about 5 operations master roles, or as they're sometimes called, flexible single master operations roles. Now, when you promote your first domain controller in a forest, you are granted these 5 operations master roles, and all of them serve a purpose within the forest. The 5 roles are the Schema Master, the Domain Naming Master, the Infrastructure Master, the PDC Emulator, and the RID Master. The first 2 roles, the Schema Master and the Domain Naming Master, are forest-wide, meaning that you can only have one Schema Master for a forest, and you can only have one Domain Naming Master per forest. The other 3, the Infrastructure Master, the PDC Emulator, and the RID Master, they can be in every domain. So in every domain, you will have an Infrastructure Master, a PDC Emulator, and a RID Master. But the only 2, Schema Master and Domain Master, those are forest-wide, and you can only have one of them per forest. Let us take a look at the Schema Master. The Schema Master controls updates and modifications to the schema. What is the schema? The schema is the structure of the Active Directory database. The schema is the component that defines all the objects and attributes that the directory service uses to store data. As the best example of schema modification, let's say, for example, that we have some objects within Active Directory. You have the user class object, you have the computer class object. Each of these objects have a structure. The username, you have fields, the last name field, you have the password field, you have the first name field, you have the initial field. When you create the user and you are adding information to the user object, you are actually filling in the fields that exist. The fields, along with the objects, make up the structure of the database. If, for example, you're creating a user and you wanted to put your birth date, you wouldn't be able to do that because no such field exists. So the fields that are there make up the structure of the database. So that would be the schema. You can only have, remember, one Schema Master within the forest. This schema role is really only necessary when modifications are being made, meaning that it can remain offline indefinitely until schema changes are necessary. Let's move to the next forest-wide role, which is the Domain Naming Master. The Domain Naming Master role controls the addition and removal of domains within the forest. This role is necessary when you are adding or removing a domain in the forest. The rest of the time, the Domain Naming Master role can remain offline for an indefinite period of time. So if you are creating a domain, an additional domain, and you wanted to add that domain if you did not have the domain naming master, you will not be able to add that domain. And also, you wouldn't be able to remove a domain from the forest. So that's a very important role when you are adding or removing domains from the forest. Next, we want to look at 3 other roles: the infrastructure master, the PDC emulator, and the RID master. Let's start with the infrastructure master. The infrastructure master is responsible for taking care of objects that reference other objects in other domains. What do I mean by that? We can have in a domain what is called a universal group. Remember that a universal group will have users from other domains. So we have 3 domains here: domain 1, domain 2, and domain 3. In domain 1, we have created a universal group. This universal group is made up of members from domain 2 and domain 3. Now, if in domain 2, the administrator had to change the name of a user, or change that user's password, or change something about that user, or even delete the user, then that information has to be sent to the universal group, or the other members need to know that. That information goes to the infrastructure master when a change has been made. The information, that change, goes to the infrastructure master, whichever server has the infrastructure master role, and the infrastructure master role then will inform the other servers or the universal group that this particular change has been made. So the infrastructure master role is to keep that group up to date of any change that is made from any user anywhere in the forest. There's one thing that we need to note about this infrastructure master role. This infrastructure master role needs to run on a domain controller that is not a global catalog. And we have looked at global catalogs in previous sessions. If the infrastructure master role is on a domain controller that is running a global catalog, it will stop updating object information because the global catalog server holds a partial replica of every object in the forest. So whenever you create something or do something or make a change, and that system is a global catalog, that system already has that change. So you need to be careful about that. That's a question that is good further for exam. The infrastructure master role needs to be run on a domain controller that is not a global catalog. The next master role that we want to look at is the PDC emulator. The PDC emulator is a domain controller that performs critical functions for the domain. Some of the functions are password changes. For example, when a user password is reset or changed, those changes are immediately replicated to the PDC emulator. The PDC emulator also takes care of backward compatibility, meaning it gives a chance to those people who are still using previous version of Windows to be able to locate a writable domain controller. Group policy. Every time you edit a GPO, that is done from the sysvol folder. If you would remember, The sysvol folder is a folder that holds the group policies. The group policies that you create are replicated to the other domain controllers from that sysvol folder. So we want to make sure that the information that goes out from the PDC emulator is able then to replicate. And this is to avoid situations where, for example, you might have two administrators editing the GPO at the same time. For example, in domain 1, you might have an administrator that will edit a group policy object the same time as an administrator in domain 2. Without the PDC emulator, the two GPO versions could not be reconciled. Because what happens is that the change goes to the PDC emulator. And the PDC emulator will then send those changes out to domain controllers, so that you will not have the situation where the two GPOs will not reconcile. The PDC emulator also deals with time synchronization. Every PDC emulator in each domain must synchronize its time with the forest root PDC emulator. This is a critical service in Active Directory. If we're going to have things like replication services functioning correctly, we need time synchronization. The PDC emulator also acts as a master browser, meaning it acts as a domain master browser for the domain. So when clients browse the Windows network, they're going to see a list of computers, domains, and servers that will appear. The PDC emulator takes care of that. The PDC emulator is the master browser. There must be a PDC emulator in every domain. And that PDC emulator role is held only by one domain controller in the domain. If it fails, then all normal operations and users will be immediately impacted. So this role must be available at all times. The next master role is called the Relative ID Master. And this role is responsible for processing relative ID pools, where you actually have a pool of IDs. The pool of IDs is given to the domain controller. The domain controller then is able to give out an ID to the user. So each user must have a unique ID. The user's ID will comprise of the ID for the domain, the relative ID, and then the security ID for the user. Remember that the security ID of every security principal, every user, must be unique. Also, I need you to remember that there is a read master, or there should be a read master in every domain. And this read master role is held by only one domain controller in that domain. If the read master is not available, you might not immediately have an impact. But when that read pool is exhausted, then you won't be able to create objects in Active Directory anymore, because you won't be able to give the object an ID. So if there is no pool of IDs, cannot create an object, can't create a user, can't create a computer, there is no ID to be given to the object. Now, even though we say that the infrastructure master, the PDC emulator, and the read master has to be on every domain controller, on every domain, not domain controller, on every domain in the forest. It can only be on one domain controller within the domain, but the role itself has to be on every domain. But if we only have one domain controller, then these roles, all of them, the tree, the infrastructure master, the PDC emulator, the read master, the schema master, and the domain naming master can all sit on a single domain controller. And you will find this especially in a small environment where you only have one domain controller. But if you have several domain controllers, you can spread out these roles to multiple domain controllers. In our next session, we're going to talk about how these roles can be transferred or seized, and why we would want to transfer these roles or why we would want to seize these roles. This is the end of our session on the flexible single master roles, and I want to thank you for listening.